For decades, King Charles believed the crown jewels represented his ultimate inheritance symbols of destiny, waiting patiently in silence for the moment they would finally belong to him. But on one quiet evening, inside a room sealed from history itself, everything changed. A single document surfaced. One clause, one truth. And in that moment, Charles realized the crown's most sacred treasures had never truly been his at all. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For Charles, the crown jewels had never been mere objects locked behind reinforced doors or preserved beneath layers of ceremonial protection. They were something far more intimate, far more personal. They represented the promise whispered into his life from the very beginning. As a child, he had been taught that these treasures were not simply ornaments of power, but living symbols of continuity, silent witnesses to centuries of triumph, survival, and sacrifice. He had grown up with the quiet certainty that one day those symbols would fall under his protection, his authority, his care. It was not arrogance, it was expectation carefully shaped over a lifetime of preparation. Every step he had taken, every burden he had endured, had been guided by the belief that the crown jewels were part of his destiny, not because he desired them, but because they defined what it meant to finally become king. There were moments in his early years when he stood near the vault's threshold, listening to the hushed reverence in the voices of those entrusted with guarding its secrets. He had been told that these objects belonged not to individuals, but to the crown itself, and someday he would be the crown. Those words had settled deep inside him, forming a bond that was emotional rather than material. The jewels became symbols of legitimacy, proof that his long and often lonely journey toward the throne had meaning. They represented the final confirmation that his waiting had not been in vain. But the revelation he now faced did not arrive with ceremony. There was no audience, no warning, no preparation. It emerged quietly during what should have been a routine review, a formality, nothing more, yet buried within sealed language, preserved with extraordinary confidentiality, lay something that would fracture everything he thought he understood. The legal instrument had been deliberately hidden, its contents protected not by secrecy alone, but by timing. It had waited patiently, just as he had waited patiently, until the precise moment when its truth could no longer be delayed. As Charles read the words, something inside him shifted in a way he had never experienced before. It was not confusion, it was recognition. Recognition that the foundation he had trusted was no longer stable. Early indications made it clear that this was not a distant plan awaiting activation. It had already happened. The transfer was complete. The authority he believed would naturally pass to him had already moved elsewhere, beyond his reach, beyond his control. He did not speak immediately. He did not react outwardly, but internally, a quiet storm had begun to take shape. A lifetime of belief had collided with a single, irreversible truth, and as that truth settled into his consciousness, it carried with it a realization far heavier than loss. It carried the unbearable weight of knowing that something he had always assumed was his responsibility had never truly been his at all. But what Charles didn't yet realize was that this document was only the surface of a far more devastating truth, one deliberately hidden until the moment he could do nothing to stop it. It wasn't written in bold letters. It wasn't announced in ceremony. It was buried quietly, deliberately inside a legal framework few had ever examined closely. A clause so precise, so final, that once activated, it could never be undone. And when Charles finally read the words himself, his hands reportedly trembled. Because this wasn't just about ownership. It was about succession, power, and a decision made long before he ever wore the crown. At first, Charles searched for reassurance in the silence, hoping that perhaps he had misunderstood the language. Royal documents were often layered, dense with tradition, and phrasing designed to preserve continuity rather than disrupt it. But this was different. The words did not offer ambiguity. They did not allow interpretation. They declared, with quiet authority, that the crown jewels vault was no longer tethered to the reigning monarch, as it had been for generations. Instead, its ownership had already been reassigned not upward toward the throne, but forward, into the hands of those who had not yet fully stepped into their destinies, his grandchildren. The very future of the monarchy had been entrusted with what Charles had always believed would define his reign. This directive had not appeared suddenly. It had been written during Queen Elizabeth's final strategic preparations, during a time when every decision she made carried the weight of permanence. She had ruled long enough to understand the fragility of institutions, the way even the strongest foundations could fracture, if not reinforced with foresight. And so, without announcement, without confrontation, she had reshaped the future of royal authority through a single legal mechanism. The clause had been sealed with extraordinary precision, shielded from scrutiny until the moment Charles could no longer challenge it. It had waited patiently, just as he had waited patiently his entire life, but, unlike his waiting, this clause had never been meant to reward him. What made the discovery even more devastating was its finality. The legal structure surrounding the transfer was impenetrable. There was no provision for reversal, no authority even for the king himself to override its intent. The sovereignty he now embodied granted him immense responsibility, yet in this one critical matter, it offered him nothing. He could safeguard the vault, he could honor its legacy, but he could never truly claim it. He had become, in the most painful sense, a guardian without ownership, a protector without possession. The realization struck deeper than any political limitation ever could, because this wasn't simply about power in the traditional sense. It was about identity. For decades, Charles had understood his future through the lens of inheritance, believing that one day the full weight of the crown's legacy would rest firmly in his hands. But now, he was confronted with a truth that altered that understanding completely. The crown jewels did not symbolize his personal culmination. They symbolized transition. They represented movement beyond him, toward a generation that had already been quietly positioned to carry forward what he had spent his life preparing to inherit. The secrecy surrounding the directive only intensified the emotional blow. This had not been a decision presented for discussion. It had been preserved in silence, protected by timing, activated at the precise moment when resistance was no longer possible. Queen Elizabeth had known exactly when to act, exactly when to ensure that her vision for the monarchy would unfold without interference. And now, Charles was left standing in the aftermath of a plan that had never required his approval. As the full implications began to sink in, Charles faced an unbearable realization. This decision hadn't been made against him suddenly, but had been quietly orchestrated years before he ever took the throne. Queen Elizabeth had ruled longer than any monarch before her, and she understood power in ways few ever could. She knew its fragility, its risks, and most importantly, she knew exactly when to act. But what she did in her final years wasn't public, it wasn't ceremonial, it was deliberate. And when Charles realized his mother had personally ensured the crown jewels would bypass him entirely, the betrayal cut deeper than any political defeat ever could. For Elizabeth, the crown had never been about possession. It had always been about preservation. She had witnessed too much across her reign, moments when public confidence trembled, when the monarchy itself stood at the edge of uncertainty. She understood that survival required more than tradition. It required foresight. It required decisions that would protect the institution long after she was gone. And in her final years, she had begun to think less like a reigning monarch and more like a guardian of time itself, carefully positioning every piece of the monarchy's future where it could endure beyond any single reign. Charles, however, had never imagined he would become one of those pieces rather than its central figure. He had spent his entire life believing that his mother's preparation of him was also a preparation for inheritance not just of responsibility, but of symbolic authority. Yet Elizabeth had seen something deeper, something that transcended personal expectation. She had seen the inevitable march of time, the unstoppable transition from one generation to the next. And in that realization, she had chosen to anchor the crown jewels, not in the present, but in the future. She had ensured they would belong to those whose lives stretched far beyond Charles's reign, those whose connection to the monarchy would define its survival decades from now. Her decision had not been impulsive. It had been precise, measured, and protected by silence. She had structured it so that its activation would occur only after her passing, removing any possibility of emotional confrontation. She had never spoken of it openly, She had never offered explanation or warning, and that silence, more than the decision itself, became the most painful part of the revelation, because Charles understood his mother well enough to know that her silence was never accidental, it was intentional. She had known exactly how he would feel. She had anticipated his disappointment, his confusion, perhaps even his sense of personal rejection. And still, she had chosen to proceed. That realization lingered heavily in Charles's mind. It forced him to confront a truth he had never wanted to consider, that his mother's ultimate loyalty had not been to him as her son, but to the crown as an institution. She had not acted out of emotion. She had acted out of duty, and that duty had demanded sacrifice, even if that sacrifice came in the form of her own son's expectations. She had carried this decision quietly, allowing him to continue believing in a future that she already knew would never unfold the way he imagined. In the end, Elizabeth had not stripped Charles of responsibility. She had given him something far more difficult. She had given him the burden of understanding that the monarchy's survival was never about individual fulfillment. It was about continuity. It was about ensuring that its most sacred symbols would outlive any single monarch, including him. And as that truth settled into his heart, it left behind a complicated mixture of pain, respect, and reluctant acceptance. But Elizabeth's decision wasn't just about protecting the future, it was about empowering specific heirs whose destinies were already quietly being written. They were children, innocent, unaware of the storm quietly forming around them. Yet without ceremony, without announcement, they had become the true owners of the crown's most sacred treasures: Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis. Their names now tied permanently to the vault Charles had believed defined his reign. And as this truth spread through the palace's inner circle, it became clear the future had already claimed what the present could never control. The realization carried a weight that went far beyond legality. This was not simply about inheritance, it was about time itself shifting forward, quietly but decisively. George, Charlotte, and Louis had not earned this authority through struggle or preparation. They had simply been born into its path, yet that was precisely what made the decision so powerful. Their ownership was not symbolic or conditional, it was immediate, activated the moment Charles became king. Without announcement, without ceremony, the vault that had represented centuries of monarchical continuity now belonged not to the man wearing the crown, but to those who would one day inherit its future. This generational transfer created something unprecedented. It ensured that the monarchy's most sacred treasures would never again be tethered solely to the identity of a single reigning monarch. Instead, they became anchored in continuity itself, held collectively by those whose lives stretched far beyond the present reign. It was a quiet but undeniable declaration that the crown was no longer defined by individual possession, but by collective legacy. And while this strengthened the institution's long-term stability, it created a deeply personal fracture within Charles's understanding of his own role. Because for Charles, this wasn't just a legal adjustment, it was an emotional displacement. He remained king. He carried the full burden of leadership, the full weight of expectation. Yet the ultimate symbol of sovereign continuity, the vault itself no longer answered to him in the way he had always imagined. He could protect it, he could honor it, but he could never claim it as his own. And that distinction, subtle yet absolute, reshaped the emotional foundation of his reign in ways few could fully comprehend. Palace advisors understood the brilliance behind Elizabeth's decision, even as they recognized its emotional consequences. By transferring ownership directly to the grandchildren, she had created an unbreakable chain linking the monarchy's past, present, and future. There would be no uncertainty, no ambiguity. The crown jewels would remain permanently aligned with the next generation, ensuring stability regardless of political shifts or personal struggles. It was a move rooted not in sentiment, but in strategic permanence. Yet, strategy offered little comfort to Charles. The knowledge lingered heavily in his thoughts, reshaping how he saw himself, his authority, and his place within the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. He was no longer the endpoint of inheritance. He was the bridge, the guardian standing between what had been and what was already coming. And while he loved his grandchildren deeply, while he understood the necessity of protecting the monarchy's future, the emotional reality remained impossible to ignore. Something he had always believed would define him now existed beyond him. In quiet moments, the truth became unavoidable. The crown jewels no longer represented the culmination of his journey. They represented its transition. They were no longer a symbol of his arrival, but a symbol of his eventual departure. And that realization carried with it a mixture of pride, sorrow, and an unspoken sense of finality that settled deep within him. But as this truth settled inside palace walls, the emotional consequences for Charles became impossible to hide. No cameras captured the moment. No official statement acknowledged it. But those closest to Charles would later whisper about what happened behind closed doors. The silence, the disbelief, the unbearable weight of realization. He had waited his entire life to inherit the crown's full authority, only to discover the most sacred symbol of that authority had already been given away. And for the first time since becoming king, Charles reportedly felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: powerless. At first, he did what he had always done when confronted with uncertainty. He turned back to the words, slowly, carefully, again and again, each time hoping that somewhere between the lines there might be an escape, a condition, a loophole, something that would restore the reality he had always believed in. But the words never changed. They remained cold, final, unyielding. Every rereading only deepened the truth he was trying to outrun. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an error. It was deliberate, and it had already been decided long before he ever had the chance to object. The pain was not loud. It did not erupt into visible anger or confrontation. It settled quietly, pressing inward, reshaping how he understood his entire life's journey. Because Charles had not simply waited to become king. He had endured decades of waiting, decades of existing in the shadow of a reign so long and so absolute that his own future had often felt suspended in time. Through those years, he had found strength in one belief: that when his moment finally arrived, he would step fully into the role he had been prepared for since birth. But now, standing at the very peak of that long-awaited ascent, he discovered that part of what he had been climbing toward had never been his to reach. Thick, those closest to him sensed the shift immediately, not through words, but through absence, a heaviness that lingered in the quiet spaces between conversations. Advisors offered reassurance, reminding him of his authority, his position, his responsibility. They spoke of duty, of legacy, of the importance of his reign. But even they could not deny the legal reality that stood before him. This was not something he could change, not something he could negotiate. The transfer had been executed with precision, leaving no room for intervention, not even from the king himself. What made it unbearable was how deeply personal it felt. This was not about public perception or political maneuvering. This was about identity, about the emotional architecture of a life built around expectation. The crown jewels had represented more than power. They had represented arrival, completion, proof that the long years of waiting had meaning, and now that meaning had been quietly redefined without his knowledge. For the first time, Charles faced the reality that his authority, while vast, was not absolute. There were boundaries he had never anticipated, limits shaped not by opposition, but by design. His reign, though legitimate and historic, existed within a framework that had already been adjusted to prioritize the future beyond him. He was not the endpoint of the monarchy's story. He was a chapter within it, a necessary presence, but not its final destination. And in that realization, something inside him shifted, not outwardly, not in ways the world could easily see, but internally, where expectation gave way to acceptance, and certainty gave way to something far more fragile, a quiet understanding that the crown, in its deepest form, had never truly belonged to any one person. But Charles's devastation wasn't the only reaction. The palace itself began to fracture under the weight of this revelation. Palaces don't shout, they whisper. And after the truth emerged, those whispers turned into quiet panic. Advisors questioned everything. Loyalists worried, and some, privately, began to wonder whether this was more than inheritance, whether it was a deliberate shift in royal power itself. Because if the jewels no longer belonged to the king, then what else had already been taken out of his hands, without him realizing? At first, the reaction remained contained, confined to private conversations and carefully chosen words spoken behind closed doors. No one dared challenge the decision openly. No one dared question Elizabeth's authority, even in absence. But beneath the discipline of royal protocol, unease spread rapidly. Those who had served the crown for decades understood what this meant. The crown jewels were not merely ceremonial objects. They were symbols of ultimate continuity, silent proof that the monarch stood at the center of the institution's authority. And now, that symbol had shifted permanently. Some advisors struggled with what this meant for Charles's position. They remained loyal to him, deeply aware of the emotional toll this revelation had already taken. To them, the decision felt like a quiet weakening of his symbolic sovereignty. Not in law, but in perception. They feared that even invisible shifts could carry real consequences. That authority, once fractured emotionally, could never fully return to its original strength. Their concern was not rebellion. It was protection. Protection of the king they had sworn to serve. Yet others saw something entirely different. To them, Elizabeth's decision was not an act of limitation, but an act of strategic brilliance. They recognized the quiet strength in what she had done. By anchoring the crown jewels directly to the next generation, she had removed uncertainty from the monarchy's future. She had created stability that no political change, no personal conflict could disrupt. In their eyes, this was not a weakening of the crown. It was its reinforcement. A guarantee that its most sacred symbols would remain permanently aligned with continuity itself, beyond the influence of any single reign. But the secrecy surrounding the clause created something far more dangerous than disagreement. It created doubt. If Elizabeth had been capable of making such a monumental decision without anyone knowing, what else might exist beneath the surface? What other directives, what other hidden structures might already be in place? The realization forced even the most loyal insiders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The monarchy's deepest decisions were often made long before their consequences became visible. And those consequences were unfolding now, in real time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the internal balance of power began to shift. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through awareness. The future no longer felt distant. It felt present. The existence of generational ownership altered how people thought, how they planned, how they imagined the monarchy's trajectory. The crown, in its purest symbolic form, was no longer centered solely on Charles. It extended forward toward those whose lives had already been quietly positioned to inherit its full weight. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone understood it. The monarchy was not weakening, it was transforming. And transformation, no matter how carefully designed, always carried consequences for those standing at its center. Charles remained king. His authority remained real, but beneath the surface, the institution itself was already preparing for something beyond him. Something inevitable. Something already set into motion long before he ever realized it. And as this quiet shift unfolded, attention turned to the one man whose future now loomed larger than ever before. William never asked for this, but suddenly everything pointed toward him. His children now controlled what had once symbolized absolute royal authority. His position strengthened without him speaking a single word, and while he remained publicly loyal to his father, palace insiders sensed something deeper unfolding. Because this wasn't just about jewels. It was about destiny and the silent moment when the future begins replacing the present. William understood the weight of inheritance in a way few others ever could. He had lived his entire life walking the careful line between preparation and patience, knowing that his future would eventually demand more from him than he could fully comprehend in the present. But this was different. This was not a responsibility handed directly to him. It was something placed quietly into the hands of his children, bypassing him entirely while still strengthening everything he represented. Without announcement, without declaration, the crown's most sacred vault had become permanently connected to his bloodline. And with that connection came a shift no one could ignore. He never spoke about it publicly. He never acknowledged it in private discussions, where its implications lingered heavily between carefully chosen words. His loyalty to his father remained intact, unwavering in its outward expression. He understood Charles's position. He understood the emotional cost of discovery, the quiet devastation of realizing that something long believed to be inevitable had already been reassigned. William did not celebrate. He did not embrace the change with visible relief, because he knew this was not a victory. It was a transition, and transitions, no matter how necessary, always carried pain. Yet the palace could feel it, the subtle but undeniable shift in how the future was now being imagined. Advisors who once focused solely on supporting Charles's reign began, almost instinctively, to look beyond it. They spoke in longer timelines. They thought in generational terms. They understood that the crown jewels, now tied directly to William's children, had redefined the monarchy's center of gravity. The institution was no longer anchored solely in the present king. It was anchored in continuity, in the inevitability of what would come next. For Charles, this shift was perhaps the most difficult part of all. He loved his son. He loved his grandchildren. There was pride in knowing that the future of the monarchy was secure within his own family. But love did not erase the emotional reality. It did not erase the quiet understanding that the institution he now led had already begun orienting itself toward the reign that would follow his own. He remained the sovereign. His authority remained absolute in law, yet symbolically, something had already begun to move beyond him. William, meanwhile, carried the weight of this transition with the same restraint that had defined his entire life. He did not seek power. He did not accelerate the inevitable. He simply stood where history had placed him, understanding that his role was no longer defined solely by preparation. It was defined by proximity. The crown's future was no longer an abstract certainty. It was something tangible, something already unfolding. And beneath the discipline of royal composure, beneath the quiet loyalty and unspoken understanding, one truth became impossible to ignore. The monarchy had already begun preparing itself for William's era, even as Charles's reign had only just begun. But the most devastating realization was still waiting for Charles: the truth about why Elizabeth had done this at all. At first, it felt like betrayal, but then came the deeper truth, the letters, the private words Elizabeth had never spoken aloud. And when Charles finally understood why she had made this decision, the pain didn't disappear, but it changed, because this had never been about denying him power. It had been about protecting something she feared might not survive without drastic action. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as fragments of Elizabeth's final intentions began to surface. These were not public declarations. They were not formal instructions meant for ceremony or acknowledgement. They were personal, carefully preserved thoughts, written in moments when she had been forced to confront the inevitable reality that her reign, no matter how enduring, would eventually come to an end. And in those private reflections, one truth became unmistakably clear. Elizabeth had never been thinking about a single reign. She had been thinking about survival, about ensuring the monarchy itself could withstand whatever storms the future might bring. She had seen how fragile public trust could become. She had witnessed moments when the crown's stability seemed less certain than its outward image suggested. Time had taught her that institutions did not endure simply because they existed. They endured because someone was willing to protect them beyond their own lifetime. And Elizabeth, perhaps more than anyone, understood that the greatest threat to continuity was not external opposition, but internal uncertainty. The crown needed anchors that extended beyond any one individual. It needed permanence rooted in generations, not personalities. Her decision to transfer ownership of the crown jewels vault directly to her grandchildren was not an act of exclusion. By placing those sacred symbols into the hands of the future itself, she ensured that no single reign, no matter how successful or how difficult, could ever destabilize their meaning. The jewels would no longer represent the authority of one monarch alone. They would represent the uninterrupted chain of continuity that defined the monarchy's survival. And in doing so, she removed the possibility of disruption before it could ever take hold. Charles began to see the decision through her eyes, though the emotional weight never fully disappeared. He understood now that her silence had not been cruelty. It had been protection. She had chosen not to burden him with a truth she knew would cause pain, because she also knew that pain could not change what needed to be done. She had carried that burden alone, preserving both her son's peace and the monarchy's future with the same quiet strength that had defined her entire reign. In that understanding came clarity, devastating, but undeniable. Elizabeth had never doubted Charles's legitimacy. She had never questioned his right to rule, but she had seen beyond his reign. She had acted not as a mother, but as a monarch whose responsibility extended beyond emotion. Her final act had not weakened the crown. It had reshaped it, ensuring that its most sacred symbols would remain permanently connected to the generations that would carry it forward. And in the end, Charles faced the most difficult truth of all: acceptance. Kings inherit power. But sometimes, power was never theirs to inherit in the first place. And as Charles stood at the center of the institution he had waited his entire life to lead, he finally understood something no one had prepared him for. The crown was never about possession, it was about preservation. And in that realization, he faced the quiet, devastating truth that his reign had already been shaped by forces beyond his control. The acceptance did not arrive easily. It did not arrive in a single moment of clarity or relief. It came slowly, through reflection, through silence, through the painful recognition that everything he had believed about inheritance had always been incomplete. For most of his life, Charles had understood the crown as something he was destined to receive fully, completely, unquestionably. But now he understood that the crown had never been something to own. It had always been something to carry, something to protect until it was time to pass it forward. And in that understanding, the emotional devastation he had carried began to transform into something quieter, something stronger. Not surrender, but resolve. He began to see Elizabeth's decision not as a rejection of him, but as an act of faith in something larger than any one reign. She had trusted him to understand eventually, trusted him to rise above personal expectation and embrace the deeper responsibility of stewardship, because stewardship did not require ownership. It required strength. It required humility. It required the willingness to guide the institution forward, even when that path led beyond himself. Charles realized that his role was not diminished by this truth. It was redefined. He was not the final destination of the crown's legacy. He was its protector during one of its most critical transitions. His thoughts increasingly turned toward his grandchildren. George, Charlotte, Louis. Their futures now carried a weight they could not yet comprehend. They represented continuity in its purest form, unbroken and unburdened by the emotional complexities he had faced. And rather than resisting that reality, Charles began to embrace it. He understood that his purpose was no longer to claim what had been secured for them. His purpose was to ensure that when their moment arrived, the monarchy they inherited would be stronger, steadier, and more enduring than ever before. In that shift, something profound occurred. The pain did not vanish, but it lost its power to define him. His reign was no longer about what he possessed. It was about what he preserved, about ensuring that the crown remained unbroken, its meaning intact, its future secure. The legacy he had once believed would culminate with him had already begun extending beyond him, and instead of resisting that truth, he stepped into it fully, accepting the quiet honor of standing as a bridge between what had been and what would come next. Because in the end, the greatest power Charles would ever hold wasn't ownership of the crown, but the strength to let it go. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.